Montana Territory, 1885. The winter wind howled across the frozen prairie, whipping snow against the weathered log cabin that stood solitary against the vast whiteness. Preston Kendrick stared out the frosted window, watching another blizzard build on the horizon. At 26, he'd already spent 8 years alone on this ranch, convinced that solitude was the price of survival in these untamed lands. "No room for softness out here," he muttered, his breath fogging the glass. "The moment you let someone matter, you give this country a way to break you." Preston had seen it happen too many times. Men who arrived with families only to lose them to disease, hunger, or the merciless winter. His own parents had taught him that lesson when they succumbed to fever during his 18th year, leaving him their modest claim and a brutal education in frontier resilience. Since then, he'd built Raven Creek Ranch into something substantial: 300 head of cattle, sturdy outbuildings, and reputation for fair dealings that brought him business from Billings to Helena. But success hadn't filled the silence of evenings like this one, when darkness fell early and the wind found every crack in the cabin walls. Sometimes, in moments of weakness, Preston wondered what might exist beyond mere survival, but he always dismissed such thoughts as dangerous indulgence. The frontier demanded vigilance, not vulnerability. Tomorrow he'd need to check his most distant pasture where the last of his herd wintered beneath the shelter of pine trees. The isolation had never bothered him before, or so he told himself as he prepared for another night alone. Morning brought bitter cold but clear skies. Preston saddled his bay gelding, Thunder, and packed provisions for what might become an overnight journey if the weather turned. He rode out as the sun crested the eastern ridge, casting long blue shadows across unblemished snow. The beauty of it never failed to stir something in his chest, pride in this harsh land, perhaps, or simply the satisfaction of enduring where others could not. For hours of hard riding brought him to the western edge of his property, where split-rail fencing marked the boundary between his claim and unclaimed government land. Beyond lay miles of wilderness, punctuated only by the occasional trapper's cabin or abandoned homestead. It was there, near the boundary marker, that he saw something impossible: a thin column of smoke rising from what had been the old Miller place, abandoned 3 winters ago when the family retreated east, broken by Montana's cruelty. Preston's hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle in his saddle holster. Squatters, perhaps, or worse, bandits using the abandoned cabin as a hideout. "Easy, boy," he murmured to Thunder as they approached. Years of frontier caution kept him alert, eyes scanning for movement, ears straining through the winter silence. What he found instead changed everything. The tiny cabin's door hung partly open, and outside, nearly buried in a snowdrift, sat the remains of a wagon, one wheel splintered beyond repair, the canvas cover shredded by wind. Preston dismounted carefully, rifle ready, and approached. "Hello, the house," he called, following frontier protocol. "I'm coming in peaceful-like." The response was so faint he almost missed it beneath the wind. "Help, please." Inside, huddled before the dying embers of a pitifully small fire, sat a young woman wrapped in every scrap of clothing and blanket she appeared to possess. Her face, framed by loose strands of deep chestnut hair escaping a once neat bun, was pale with cold except for feverish spots of color high on her cheekbones. Despite her obvious distress, her blue eyes widened with alarm at his entrance. "I mean no harm, ma'am," Preston said, lowering his rifle. "This is part of my ranching territory." Preston Kendrick of Raven Creek. She attempted to stand, but wavered, clearly weakened. "Olivia Neill," she managed. "Our wagon. We were bound for Oregon when the axle broke. My father went for help 8 days ago. He should have returned." Preston felt his stomach tighten. 8 days in this wilderness in winter? No man could survive that long without shelter, not with the temperatures they'd had. "You've been alone all this time?" he asked, already knowing the grim truth about her father's fate. "I had supplies," she said with surprising dignity for someone so clearly at the edge of endurance. "But the firewood is nearly gone, and Her voice faltered. "I fear something has happened to father." Preston assessed her condition with experienced eyes. 21, maybe 22, and clearly educated from her speech. Her dress, though dirty from travel, was of good quality, dark blue wool with delicate embroidery at the collar. But most importantly, She was suffering from the early stages of exposure and would not survive another night alone with that inadequate fire. Everything in him rebelled against the complication she represented. His careful, solitary existence had no place for a helpless Easterner. Yet what choice did he have? Leaving her meant death as certain as if he'd shot her himself. "Miss Neill," he said firmly, "I cannot sugarcoat this. If your father ventured out 8 days ago in these conditions, I'm afraid hope is slim. And you cannot stay here. My ranch is 4 hours' ride, but it's your best chance." For a moment, rebellion flashed across her features, pride warring with desperation. Then practicality won out. "I cannot abandon hope for my father," she said. "But I accept your assistance, Mr. Kendrick." Within an hour, Preston had bundled her onto Thunder, wrapped in his spare blankets and his own heavy coat. He walked alongside, leading the horse through deepening snow as clouds gathered ominously overhead. The woman, Olivia, tried valiantly to remain upright, but exhaustion and cold soon had her swaying dangerously in the saddle. "Miss Neill," he said gruffly, "you must allow me to ride behind you. You'll fall otherwise, and we've miles yet to go." Her barely perceptible nod was all the permission he received. Preston swung up behind her, one arm securing her trembling form against his chest. The unfamiliar intimacy made him acutely uncomfortable. He hadn't been this close to another human in years, let alone a woman. But necessity overruled propriety. They'd covered less than 2 miles when the storm hit with unexpected ferocity. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted. "We need shelter," Preston shouted above the gale. "There's a line shack half a mile east. We'll wait it out there." The primitive one-room cabin used by his ranch hands during summer cattle drives was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it contained a small stove, dry firewood, and basic provisions. Preston half-carried Olivia inside, her strength finally failing as he set her on the rough plank floor. With practiced efficiency, he got a fire blazing in the stove, melted snow for water, and searched through the shack's meager supplies, finding jerky, coffee, and beans. Only when the tiny cabin began to warm did he turn his full attention to his unexpected charge. She was worse than he'd first thought. Her lips held a bluish tinge, and her shivering had given way to an ominous stillness that anyone who'd survived Montana winters recognized as dangerous. "Miss Neill," he said sharply, crouching beside her. "Olivia, you must stay awake." Her eyes fluttered open. "So cold," she whispered. "I cannot feel my hands." Preston knew what needed to be done, though everything in him resisted. "Forgive me," he said stiffly, "but your life depends on getting warm." He removed his gloves and took her hands between his own, rubbing vigorously to restore circulation. Her fingers were like ice, and the intimacy of touching a lady this way made him profoundly uncomfortable. Yet as color gradually returned to her face, relief overshadowed his discomfort. "You have kind hands," she murmured, her voice slurred with exhaustion, "for such an unkind man." Preston's head snapped up, startled by her assessment. "Unkind? Your eyes," she said, gaze steadier now. "They're wary. Like you expect the worst from everyone." Preston withdrew his hands abruptly. "The frontier teaches caution," he said coldly. "Those who survive learn it quickly." "Is survival all that matters?" she asked. The question hung between them, unsettlingly perceptive. Preston busied himself preparing a simple meal, uncomfortable with how easily this stranger had identified his core belief. As night fell, the blizzard intensified. Even Thunder, sheltered in the lean-to attached to the cabin, whinnied nervously at the storm's fury. Inside, the small stove struggled against the plummeting temperature. Preston added more wood, knowing they'd need to conserve their limited supply. Olivia had regained some strength after eating, but exhaustion pulled at her. "Will we make it to your ranch tomorrow?" she asked, huddled near the stove. "If the storm breaks," Preston replied. "Otherwise, we stay put. Only fools travel in weather like this." "Like my father did," she said quietly. Preston hesitated, then said what honesty demanded. "Your father likely had no choice. He was trying to save you." Tears welled in her eyes. "He was all I had left. Mother died last year. That's when we decided to start fresh in Oregon." She looked around the sparse cabin. "I never imagined ending up like this, dependent on a stranger's mercy in the middle of nowhere." "This nowhere is my home," Preston said, more defensively than he'd intended. She studied him with surprising intensity for someone so recently at death's door. "Do you have family, Mr. Kendrick? Is someone waiting for you at Raven Creek?" "No," he answered shortly. "Just the cattle and the land." "That sounds lonely." "It's safe," he countered. "The frontier destroys families. I've seen it too many times. A man alone answers to no one and risks nothing that matters." "Except his humanity," she said softly. Preston turned away, unwilling to acknowledge how deeply her words cut. "You should rest, Miss Neill. Take the cot. I'll keep the fire going." Through the night, Preston sat against the wall, watching flames dance behind the stove's iron grate. Across the tiny room, Olivia's breathing eventually steadied into sleep. The storm howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending occasional gusts of snow down the chimney to hiss against hot metal. Despite his intention to remain vigilant, exhaustion claimed Preston sometime before dawn. He woke with a start to find gray light filtering through the cabin's single window and Olivia kneeling by the stove, adding wood to the fire with careful precision. "You should have woken me," he said, instantly alert. She glanced over her shoulder. "You needed rest as much as I did, Mr. Kendrick. Besides, I'm not entirely helpless." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Father raised me to be practical, if nothing else." The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of impossibly deep drifts and snow-laden trees sparkling in morning light. Preston stepped outside to check on Thunder and assess their situation. The snow would make travel difficult, but clear skies meant they could safely attempt the journey to Raven Creek. When he returned, Olivia had prepared coffee using the last of the supplies. She offered him a cup, and he accepted with awkward thanks, unaccustomed to being served by anyone. "Can we search for my father?" she asked, her calm tone belied by the tension in her shoulders. Preston hesitated. "We need to get you safely to the ranch first. Then I'll organize a proper search party." Hope flickered across her face. "Then you think there's a chance he survived?" The truth would be cruel, but false hope crueler still. "Miss Neill, I believe your father was a good man who did everything possible to save you. But these mountains in winter..." He shook his head. "We'll search, but you must prepare yourself for what we're likely to find." Tears welled again, but she blinked them back. "I understand. Thank you for your honesty, at least." The journey to Raven Creek Ranch took most of the day, with Preston walking ahead to break trail and Thunder struggling through snowdrifts, often reaching his chest. They spoke little, conserving energy for the difficult travel, but Preston found himself increasingly aware of Olivia's quiet fortitude. Despite grief and hardship, she never complained, even when fatigue clearly weighed on her. When the main house finally came into view, a substantial two-story log structure with smoke curling from the stone chimney, Preston felt an unfamiliar discomfort. His private domain would no longer be solely his, even temporarily. Martha Jenkins, the widow who rode over from the neighboring homestead twice weekly to cook and clean for him, had apparently visited during his absence. The house was warm, a pot of stew simmered on the stove, and fresh bread waited on the sideboard. Olivia swayed with exhaustion when he helped her from the horse. Without thinking, Preston lifted her into his arms, carrying her into the house and setting her gently in the chair nearest the fireplace. "This is quite a home," she said, looking around at the surprisingly comfortable interior. Polished wood floors, sturdy furniture, bookshelves filled with volumes, Preston's one indulgence, and carefully crafted touches that revealed years of patient improvement. "It serves its purpose," he replied, suddenly self-conscious about what her Eastern eyes might see as frontier crude. "It's lovely," she said simply. "You've built something real here." The following days established an uneasy routine. Preston organized search parties of neighboring ranchers to look for Olivia's father, though privately, he held no hope. Meanwhile, Olivia slowly regained her strength, confined mostly to the guest bedroom by Preston's insistence and her own lingering weakness. Martha Jenkins, initially suspicious of the young woman's presence, soon became Olivia's staunch ally, bringing her proper clothing borrowed from her own daughter and spending extra days at the ranch to provide female companionship. A week passed, then two. The search parties returned empty-handed, though they found the remains of Olivia's father's campfire and tracks leading toward the nearest town, tracks that disappeared in what must have been the first of several blizzards. As winter deepened, Even Preston had to admit that continuing the search was futile until spring thaw. Breaking this news to Olivia was among the hardest things Preston had ever done. He expected tears, hysterics perhaps, but instead found dignity and quiet grief that somehow cut deeper than any outburst might have. "I think I've known since that first night," she admitted, sitting by the window in the parlor, staring out at the snow-covered yard. "Father was strong, but no one is stronger than this wilderness." "I'm sorry," Preston said, the words inadequate. "When spring comes, we'll find him proper and give him a Christian burial." Olivia turned to him, her blue eyes red-rimmed but dry. "You've done more than most would for a stranger, Mr. Kendrick. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "There's no debt," he said gruffly. "Anyone would do the same." "No," she said with surprising certainty. "They wouldn't. Not everyone has your sense of responsibility or your well-hidden heart." The comment discomfited him, and he retreated to the barn, burying himself in work that required no emotional navigation. Yet Olivia's words followed him, undermining convictions he'd held for years. As December yielded to January, Olivia's presence transformed Raven Creek in ways both subtle and profound. The house, once merely functional, became genuinely welcoming. She insisted on taking over cooking from Martha, revealing considerable skill that made mealtime something Preston found himself anticipating rather than merely enduring. More disconcerting were the evenings. Previously, Preston had spent them in solitary reading or taciturn planning for the ranch's next season. Now, Olivia would sit across from him by the fire, sometimes reading from his library, sometimes mending clothing, but often simply talking, drawing him into conversations he'd never imagined having. "What made you choose ranching?" she asked one night as snow tapped gentle fingers against the windows. Preston looked up from his ledger, surprised by her interest. "My father started this place. After he and my mother died, continuing seemed the only path forward." "But you love it," she observed. "I can see it when you return from riding the property. Your whole demeanor changes when you speak about the land or the cattle." Preston considered this. "I suppose I do. There's honesty in this work. The land gives back what you put into it. No more, no less. Animals don't lie or disappoint you if you understand their needs." "Unlike people?" she asked quietly. "People are complicated," he admitted. "And complication is dangerous out here," she supplied, echoing his earlier sentiments. Preston set down his pencil. "When I was 16, my best friend's family tried homesteading 10 miles east of here. Good people, hard-working, God-fearing. They lost 2 children to diphtheria the first winter. His mother to childbed fever the second. His father started drinking after that, and one night wandered out into a blizzard." Preston stared into the fire. "I helped bury what was left of him come spring." "That's terrible," Olivia said softly. "It's common," Preston countered. "The McGraths, the Westfalls, the Andersons, all families who came with hopes and left broken, if they left at all." He met her gaze directly. "That's why I choose to stand alone. No one to lose, no one to fail, no one to bury. And no one to help carry the burden," Olivia said. "No one to share the beauty alongside the hardship." Preston had no answer for that. January brought a brief thaw followed by renewed cold that turned the ranch into an ice-covered kingdom. With travel impossible and work limited to essential care of the animals, Preston found himself spending more time indoors than he had in years. To his surprise, he began teaching Olivia about ranch operations, first through conversation, then with practical demonstrations when weather permitted. She proved a quick study, asking intelligent questions about cattle breeding, pasture rotation, and market considerations. "Why are you interested in all this?" he asked one afternoon as they reviewed his carefully kept breeding records. "I need to understand how to survive here," she answered matter-of-factly. "Unless you intend to support me indefinitely, I must find my way forward." The practical reminder of her temporary status struck Preston with unexpected force. Of course, she wouldn't stay permanently. Come spring, she would either continue west as originally planned or return east to whatever family remained. The realization disturbed him more than it should have. February arrived with brutal cold but increasing light. Preston found excuses to take Olivia on short rides around the immediate property, showing her the operation he'd built, secretly pleased by her genuine appreciation for his accomplishments. During one such outing, They crested a hill overlooking the valley where his cattle wintered in relative shelter. The afternoon sun turned the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds, and even the breath steaming from the gathered herd seemed magical in the crystalline air. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen," Olivia said, her face glowing with cold and wonder. Preston found himself watching her instead of the view, captivated by the animation in her features. At 22, with months of grief behind her, Olivia Neill possessed a vitality that made his carefully ordered existence feel suddenly hollow. "Preston," she said, using his given name for the first time, "do you ever imagine sharing all this with someone?" The question struck too close to thoughts he'd been deliberately avoiding. "The ranch will pass to whoever buys it when I'm gone," he said stiffly. "I've no family to inherit." "That's not what I meant," she said softly. The air between them changed, charged with unspoken possibility. Preston turned away first, uncomfortable with feelings he'd spent years suppressing. "We should head back." Storm clouds building to the north. The ride home passed in silence, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement neither was ready to confront directly. That night, Preston sat alone in his study long after Olivia had retired, wrestling with unwelcome truths. The woman upstairs had somehow breached walls he'd built over 8 years of deliberate isolation. Worse, he was beginning to question whether those walls had ever protected him or merely imprisoned him. A loud pounding at the front door startled him from his thoughts. At this hour, in this weather, a visitor could only mean trouble. He opened the door to find Sheriff Thomas Riker stomping snow from his boots. "Evening, Preston," the lawman said grimly. "Needed to warn you. Silas Vaughn broke out of territorial prison last week. Word is he's headed this direction." Preston felt the blood drain from his face. "Vaughn? You sure?" His cellmate talked. Said Silas spent 3 years planning revenge on the man who testified against him. The sheriff's expression was grave. "That would be you, Preston. Does anyone else know he's headed here?" Preston asked, thinking of Olivia sleeping upstairs. "Just told Martha and her husband on my way through. Figured they should be alert, being your nearest neighbors." Sheriff Riker peered past Preston into the house. "Martha mentioned you had a young lady staying here? Rescue situation?" "Miss Neill?" "Yes," Preston confirmed. "Found her stranded when her wagon broke down. Her father was lost in the storms. Might be safer if she relocated to town until this blows over," the sheriff suggested. "Vaughn was never particular about who got hurt during his crimes." Preston nodded grimly. "I'll bring her in tomorrow if the weather holds." After the sheriff departed, Preston secured the house with extra care, checking his firearms and placing them strategically. The thought of Vaughn anywhere near Olivia made his blood run cold. The man had been a rustler and murderer before Preston's testimony had helped send him to prison. Now, with revenge as motivation, he'd be even more dangerous. Morning brought heavy snowfall that ruled out any journey to town. Preston found Olivia in the kitchen preparing breakfast, unaware of the threat that had arrived with the night. "You look troubled," she observed, setting a plate before him. Preston hesitated, then explained the situation in careful terms, downplaying the danger while making clear the precautions they needed to take. To his surprise, Olivia received the news with remarkable composure. "What can I do to help?" she asked practically. "Stay inside. Keep doors locked when I'm out with the stock. And if I tell you to hide, you do it without question." She nodded, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't sharing all her thoughts. "This man, he was imprisoned because of your testimony. Among others," Preston acknowledged. 3 years ago, Vaughn and his gang were rustling cattle across 3 territories. They killed 2 ranchers who caught them in the act. I tracked them after they hit the Jenkins's place and provided evidence that helped the territorial marshal capture them. "You're a brave man, Preston Kendrick," Olivia said quietly. He shook his head. "Just doing what needed doing. Same as now." For the next week, Preston maintained hypervigilance, sleeping little and checking the property boundaries daily despite the continued snowfall. Olivia matched his caution, never questioning his instructions even as tension built within the household. Then came the evening when Preston returned from the barn to find Olivia standing frozen at the kitchen window. "Someone's out there," she whispered as he entered. "By the edge of the trees. I saw movement." Preston immediately extinguished the lamp, plunging the kitchen into darkness broken only by firelight from the main room. He moved to the window, careful to stay to one side where he couldn't be easily spotted. At first, he saw nothing but snow-covered yard and the dark line of trees beyond. Then, movement. A shadow detached itself briefly from the forest edge before disappearing again. Upstairs, Preston said quietly. The small bedroom at the back. Lock yourself in and don't come out until I call you. Olivia hesitated. Preston, go, he said more firmly. Please. Once she had gone, Preston retrieved his rifle from beside the door and positioned himself where he could watch the yard without being seen. Minutes stretched into an hour with no further movement from the treeling. Had it been an animal? A trick of shadow and wind-blown snow? Preston was about to relax his vigil when a flicker of light caught his attention, not from the trees, but from the direction of the barn. Fire! He burst from the house, rifle ready, racing toward the growing flames that were already beginning to lick up the barn's wooden walls. The animals inside were panicking, their distressed sounds carrying through the night. It was the perfect diversion, Preston realized too late. As he neared the barn, intent on saving the horses, a figure stepped from behind the well house, leveling a pistol at him. Been a long time, Kendrick, said Silas Vaughn, his weathered face twisted with malice. 3 years in territorial prison gives a man time to think about repaying debts. Preston froze, acutely aware of his rifle pointed at the ground and the impossibility of raising it before Vaughn could fire. The law's already looking for you, Silas, he said, playing for time. Killing me won't help your situation. Vaughn's laugh was humorless. My situation is a hanging whenever they catch me. Might as well enjoy some satisfaction first. His eyes glinted in the firelight. Heard you had a woman staying here. Thought I'd pay her a visit after I finish with you. Cold fury replaced fear in Preston's chest. You'll never touch her. Who's going to stop me? Vaughn taunted. You'll be dead. And from what I've observed these past days, there's no one else around for miles. Preston's mind raced. The fire was spreading, but the animals would have to fend for themselves. Olivia was what mattered now. She's already gone, Preston lied. Sheriff Riker took her to town days ago when we heard you escaped. Doubt flickered across Vaughn's face. You're lying. Check the house if you don't believe me. But first you'll have to shoot me, and that'll bring every rancher within 10 miles. Gunshots carry in this cold. Vaughn's finger tightened on the trigger. Worth it to watch you die. The shot that rang out wasn't from Vaughn's pistol. The outlaw staggered, a look of shock replacing his sneer as he clutched his shoulder. He whirled toward the house, raising his gun toward the new threat. Preston didn't hesitate. He brought his rifle up and fired, catching Vaughn square in the chest. The outlaw crumpled to the snow without another word. On the porch stood Olivia, Preston's old revolver still held in trembling hands. I couldn't stay hidden, she said as he ran to her. Not when he was going to kill you. The aftermath unfolded in a blur of activity. The barn fire was contained before it could spread to the house, though the structure itself was heavily damaged. Sheriff Riker, alerted by Martha Jenkins who had seen the flames from her homestead, arrived the following day to confirm Vaughn's identity and take charge of the body. Through it all, Olivia remained by Preston's side, her quiet strength a revelation. She had disobeyed his instructions but saved his life in doing so, challenging his perceptions in ways that could no longer be ignored. When they were finally alone again, the house secured for the night and the ordeal behind them, Preston found her sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with a distant expression. I never thought I could shoot a man, she said without looking up. Father taught me to use a gun for hunting, but this was different. Preston sat beside her. You did what was necessary. Same as I did 3 years ago when I testified against him. Is that what life is here? Doing what's necessary to survive? She turned to face him, her expression troubled. Is there room for anything more? The question pierced him more deeply than Vaughn's bullet could have. For years, Preston had convinced himself that survival was enough, that connections were liabilities in this harsh land. Yet in that moment of crisis, what had driven him wasn't self-preservation but the desperate need to protect Olivia. I used to think survival was all that mattered, he said slowly. That anything else was weakness the frontier would exploit. And now, she asked softly, now I wonder if I've been wrong all along. Preston took a deep breath. When Vaughn threatened you, nothing else mattered. Not the ranch, not the animals, not even my own life. Just keeping you safe. Olivia's eyes widened. Preston, I don't know what that means, he continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken inside him. I only know that the thought of you leaving come spring feels like losing something I cannot afford to lose. I have nowhere to go, she admitted. No family waiting, no prospects in Oregon or back east. These past months, I've been wondering what becomes of me when winter ends. Preston reached for her hand, an intimacy that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Stay, he said simply. Not as my guest or my responsibility, but as something else, something more. Are you certain? She asked, though her fingers tightened around his. A few months ago, you believed attachments were dangerous out here. They are, he acknowledged. But I'm beginning to think the alternative is worse, surviving without really living. He met her gaze directly. I can't promise the frontier won't bring hardship. I can only promise you won't face it alone. March brought the first true signs of thaw. Icicles dripping from eaves, patches of earth emerging from beneath shrinking snowdrifts, and the unmistakable scent of awakening soil carried on southerly breezes. With spring's arrival came decisions that could no longer be deferred. A letter arrived from the territorial capital confirming what they already suspected. The belongings in Olivia's abandoned wagon legally belonged to her as her father's sole heir, though most had been ruined by exposure or claimed by winter scavengers. Preston rode with her to the site where he'd first found her, now transformed by melting snow into a muddy clearing. Little remained of the wagon beyond its basic frame and scattered, waterlogged possessions. Among the ruins, Olivia found a small metal box containing family documents, including her mother's wedding ring and a daguerreotype of her parents in happier days. She clutched these treasures to her chest, tears flowing freely. This is all that's left of them, she said. Everything else is gone. Preston dismounted and stood beside her. Not everything, he said gently. You carry them with you. Their courage in starting fresh, their determination to build something new, that lives in you. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears, yet somehow hopeful. Is that enough? To honor their memory by finding my own path forward. I believe it is, Preston replied. The search party found Olivia's father's remains 2 weeks later, just as the last snow retreated from north-facing slopes. As Preston had suspected, the man had succumbed to exposure while trying to reach the nearest town. They buried him in the small cemetery on Raven Creek property, beneath a pine tree with a view of mountains he had tried to conquer. Standing beside the fresh grave, Olivia placed wildflowers on the mounded earth. He wanted something better for us, she said. A place to belong after we lost Mother and our home back east. Preston took her hand, a gesture that had become natural over the intervening months. He succeeded, though not in the way he imagined. She looked up at him questioningly. He brought you here, Preston explained. To Raven Creek. To me. As April unfurled across the valley, bringing the year's first calves and an explosion of wildflowers across the lower meadows, Preston Kendrick found himself contemplating changes that went far beyond the seasonal cycle of his ranch. The barn had been rebuilt, stronger than before. The cattle were thriving, with the spring count showing more successful births than any previous year. And throughout the rebirth happening around him, Olivia had become essential, not just to the daily operations of Raven Creek, but to the vision of what it could become. On a perfect spring morning, with the sun rising gold over the eastern ridge, Preston asked Olivia to ride with him to the overlook where they had first acknowledged the unspoken connection between them. The valley spread below them like a painting, emerald pastures, Silver Creek, and the distant figures of cattle grazing peacefully. Raven Creek Ranch had never looked more alive. When I found you in that cabin, Preston said, I thought you were a complication I couldn't afford. Another example of how the frontier punishes those who dare to want more than mere survival. Olivia smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that still captivated him. And now I understand what I couldn't then. He turned to face her fully. The frontier doesn't just take. It gives, too, if you're brave enough to accept what it offers. And what has it offered you? She asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. A second chance, he said simply. A reason to build something that matters beyond myself. A future that's about more than enduring alone. Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the morning light, his mother's ring, preserved through years when he'd thought he would never have use for it. I can't promise an easy life, he said, holding the ring between them. The frontier doesn't allow for that. But I can promise that whatever comes, harsh winters, drought summers, good years and bad, we'll face it together. If you'll have me. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, but her smile never faltered. I never expected to find home in a place so wild, she said, or love with a man who believed himself incapable of it. She extended her hand. Yes, Preston Kendrick. Whatever the frontier brings, I choose to face it with you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Preston felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble away. The belief that had defined his adult life, that isolation was the price of survival in this untamed land, gave way to a new understanding. That true strength came not from standing alone, but from finding someone with whom to weather life's storms. By June, wildflowers carpeted the hillsides around Raven Creek Ranch, and Olivia Neill became Olivia Kendrick in a ceremony attended by neighboring ranchers who had helped search for her father and now celebrated the unexpected joy his tragedy had ultimately yielded. The ranch house, once merely a place of shelter, became truly a home. The rooms that had known only Preston's solitary existence filled with shared laughter, occasional arguments, and the everyday miracle of two lives intertwined. When winter returned, bringing with it memories of their first desperate meeting, Preston no longer viewed the season as an adversary to be endured. Instead, as snow blanketed the valley and firelight danced across the walls of their bedroom, he held his wife close and whispered thanks for the blizzard that had brought her to his door and the spring that had thawed more than just the frozen landscape. In the years that followed, Raven Creek Ranch prospered beyond what Preston had ever imagined possible. The herds grew, the buildings expanded, and eventually, children's laughter joined the symphony of sounds that marked the passing seasons. Through drought years and bountiful harvests, through the grief of inevitable losses and the joy of unexpected blessings, Preston and Olivia Kendrick built a legacy that proved his former belief wrong. The frontier was indeed harsh and unforgiving, but it was also the setting for the most profound truth Preston had ever discovered, that a heart once frozen by fear could thaw completely in the warmth of love that refused to accept mere survival as enough.